In this video, we'll be talking about the plasma settings within OptimumCNC plasma cutting software. The plasma settings can be accessed by going into the Advanced tab from within the top ribbon, and then heading into the Settings down at the bottom, after which we'll head into this pop-up tab. This will contain our cutting timeline, as well as some information on our current power source, which for me is PowerMax Sync, and our ohmic sensing ring, as well as our cartridge. Here we mostly are interested with the timeline, which is the focus of the plasma settings. The timeline contains a graph with an x-axis for time and a y-axis for height. So as you go through the cut, the left side of the graph signifies the beginning of the cut, and the right side signifies the end of the cut. Let us go through the values one by one to see what each one of them means. So first of all, we have a torch that is moving down, as you can see in this graph. It will make contact with the working material, with our metal, after which it will go up to a certain height, A, or our ignition height. So after contact, the torch will rise to this height, and then it will wait for the arc signal, for the machine to give a signal that the arc is on. Next we have our value B, our switch correction. So this is a correction for the sensor, or the difference, the distance between where our probe is and where the bottom of our cutting torch is. So for an ohmic ring, if we're touching the ohmic ring to the metal, the correction is obviously 0. However, if we're also utilizing a probe, and if that probe is triggered instead of the ohmic sensor, then the correction will not be 0. It will typically be something, some small value that is the difference between the position of the sensor and the position of the plasma torch. Again, this is typically set once per machine and does not need to be changed very often. Next, after we have waited for the arc signal, we will go to our pierce height, which is this value D, and we will pierce the material for an allocated pierce time, which is this value C. And after the pierce has completed, we will begin cutting. So here we have our pierce procedure, which we have completed. We have pierced the material for our pierce time, and we go typically down to our value G, or our cutting height. But however, we don't enable our torch height control immediately, or rather we don't have to enable it immediately. The reason this is done is because at the very start of our cutting, sometimes what happens is there's a lot of metal splashing, there's a lot of voltage variations, and this will make the torch move pretty erratically during the initial cutting phase. So what is recommended typically is to have some small amount of a THC start delay in order to prevent the THC from making the torch move very quickly up and down. And after we have had this small delay, we can begin the cutting, and the torch height control will kick in and will make the torch move up and down automatically. So next we cut the metal, we cut the part, all the while our torch height control is enabled. However, before we reach the end of the cut, sometimes we also have a torch height control pre-off, or THC pre-off value, which is value H. What this value does is it also allows us to prevent sudden movements due to rapid voltage changes as the cut is finishing up. And in this case, this sometimes happens when, for instance, if you're finishing cutting a hole and the metal is going to drop through, there will be a large jump in voltage. And the torch, in order to accommodate for that jump in voltage, will dive into the metal to try and essentially keep itself at the same level as it was before. Obviously, this is not desirable, so sometimes we can enable the THC to be turned off just a little bit prematurely in order to prevent that dive. And this is the THC pre-off, which is the time in seconds that the THC will be turned off before the end of the cut. Finally, we also have the cutting pre-off, which is the time that is allowed for the cutting to be stopped before the actual part is finished. So essentially we're stopping the cutting some fraction of a second before the machine stops moving at its working speed. And this is useful for some operators and some users depending on their cutting needs. For instance, if you are cutting a piece of metal and you have a metal part that will be dropping after you finish the cut, perhaps you don't want to actually finish or finalize that cut. Perhaps you want to leave just a tiny little bit of metal so you can remove that part by hand, etc. So this is typically kept at 0. However, there are some instances where an operator might choose to have some small amount of cutting pre-off time. And finally, after the cut has complete, we're going to go up to our travel height, which is our height that we left the torch after the cut. And this is essentially a safe height for the machine. So this about covers the basics of plasma settings and the way you can set up initial height control and torch height control within the software. Thank you for watching.